This video will change your perception of the history of the Wild West. How can one survive winter in a cabin on the frontier? No one today would be able to do it, but people somehow managed to do so back then. How exactly? I will tell you today. The romantic image of a log cabin on the frontier with a cozy fire in the fireplace and a snowy landscape outside the window has become firmly entrenched in our minds. We imagine a quiet, peaceful life in harmony with nature. But what if I told you that this idyllic picture is just a facade, behind which lies a cruel and exhausting struggle for survival? Winter in the Wild West was no fairy tale. It was a silent, cold enemy that laid siege to every settler family for months on end. The cabin was not just a home, but a fortress. And every day inside it was a battle where the price of defeat was absolute. Watch this video to the end to learn what unseen enemies awaited settlers inside their own homes, and how a simple needle and axe became the main tools in a months-long battle, not for life, but for survival. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the frontier. A settler's log cabin was not just a dwelling in our modern understanding. It was a carefully designed machine whose sole function was to preserve the heat and lives of its inhabitants. Every element of the structure, from the foundation to the roof, served this single purpose. Settlers understood that their main enemy was not the wild nature outside, but the relentless loss of precious heat. Therefore, construction was an art of compromise. Windows were made small and doors low to minimize heat loss, even if it meant living in constant semi-darkness. The location of the hut on the terrain was crucial. They tried to build it on the southern slope of a hill to make the most of the sun's heat and protect it from the north by a forest or a natural escarpment from the piercing winter winds. A mistake in choosing a location could cost the settlers everything. The walls made of massive logs served not only as shelter, but also as a heat accumulator. During the day, they slowly absorbed heat from the hearth and the sparse sun, and at night they slowly released it, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. It was a simple but effective principle of passive heating. Inside the hut was a single open space. Interior partitions were a luxury, as they interfered with the circulation of warm air from the only source, the hearth. The whole family's life took place in one room, where they ate, slept, and worked. The floor was often just packed earth, sometimes covered with boards. Such a floor was not particularly clean, but it had no gaps through which icy air could penetrate from below. It was a practical, albeit uncomfortable, solution. The roof was another critical element. It was carefully covered with turf, bark, or shingles in several layers, creating a barrier to cold air. The layer of snow that accumulated on the roof served as additional, natural insulation. Even the furniture inside was part of the survival system. The high backs of chairs and benches placed by the fire protected those sitting from the drafts that swept across the floor. Beds often had a canopy that created a small, warmer space for sleeping. The hut was not just a shelter, but an extension of its inhabitants' will to live. Every nail hammered in, every seam caulked, was an act of fighting the cold. It was a fortress built of wood, clay, and unyielding perseverance. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about the secrets of survival in the past. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think modern people could endure months of isolation in such conditions, relying only on their wits? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the harsh truth about the true heart of a 19th century American frontier cabin? It was not the dining table where the family gathered for meals, but the hearth or cast iron stove, the source of fire. This source of flame, burning day and night, was the absolute center of the pioneer settlers' universe, around which literally all winter life revolved from dawn to dusk. But paradoxically, it was also the most voracious, insatiable monster, demanding constant sacrifices of fuel. Without fire, the hut turned into an icy coffin within hours. Death from hypothermia came quickly in an uninsulated wooden house in -20-degree weather, so fire was worshipped and fed continuously like a living creature on which the life of the whole family depended. It was a god that was prayed to and served daily with offerings of firewood, not daring to anger it by letting it go out for fear of death from the cold. Providing this insatiable monster with sufficient fuel was the main priority and the most physically demanding task of the long winter for the men of the family. The family had to prepare a huge amount of firewood well in advance of the first snowfalls in October, and the amount required was enormous, difficult for a modern person to imagine. It was empirically estimated that for one average winter of 5 or 6 months of continuous heating and daily hot meal preparation, a family needed at least 15-20 cords of dry firewood, the minimum for survival. A smaller supply meant the risk of freezing in February-March, when the firewood ran out and spring was still far away, and it was impossible or deadly dangerous to replenish supplies in the snow. So it was better to stock up with a surplus than to fall short and die from a shortage in the coldest month of winter. A cord, a standard American measure, is a tightly packed wood pile with a volume of about 3.6 cubic meters or 128 cubic feet. A cubic meter of wood. Preparing such a huge amount of wood, dozens of tons, was a titanic and exhausting task that required weeks or months of continuous hard work with an axe and a two-handed saw in the forest. From dawn to dusk, the men and teenage boys of the family spent the entire daylight hours in the surrounding forest, felling living trees with axes and sawing the trunks into short logs for the hearth. It was back-breaking work that destroyed their backs and hands, but without it, the family was doomed to die of cold in winter. So there was no choice. Either work to exhaustion in autumn or freeze in winter. And this choice forced them to work without pity for themselves, overcoming pain and fatigue for the sake of the family's future survival in the cold months. The quality and type of firewood were of critical importance for heating efficiency and labor savings. Unconditional preference was given to hard deciduous trees such as oak, maple, ash, or hickory, which burned slowly, smoldered for a long time, and produced a lot of concentrated heat per unit volume. Coniferous species, pine, spruce, burned quickly and intensely like gunpowder, giving off short-lived heat and a lot of acrid soot and smoke, clogging the chimney and requiring frequent cleaning. One solid oak log was worth 3 pine logs in terms of heat output and burning time. So hunting for deciduous trees in the forest was a priority, even though they were heavier and more difficult to cut and saw. But they paid off in terms of savings in stock volume and harvesting time. It was better to cut down 1 oak than 3 pines for the same amount of heat in winter. Firewood had to be well dried in the sun and wind for at least 6 months to a year. Using wet, freshly cut wood with a moisture content of more than 20% was extremely inefficient and wasteful, as most of the energy from combustion was wasted on evaporating water from the wood rather than generating useful heat for the home. Therefore, a neat wood pile near the hut was not just a fuel supply, but a strategic life support object, which was carefully protected from thieves, snow, and rain by covering it with a top. Damp firewood was a disaster. It did not burn, smoked, and did not provide heat, turning heating into a torture of fruitless time spent maintaining a smoldering fire that did not give off heat. So drying wood was no less important than harvesting it, requiring time and planning a year in advance, which demanded discipline and foresight not always inherent in impulsive pioneers. Even when tons of firewood had been harvested and dried, the daily work with it did not stop all winter. Every single day, large logs had to be chopped into smaller pieces with an axe, spending hours carrying them in armfuls into the house through the cold and snow and constantly maintaining the fire in the hearth, adding wood every hour or two. This cyclical process was endless, taking away precious energy and time that could theoretically have been spent on other useful things, repairs, hunting, educating children. But fire was a tyrant that brooked no neglect. If you were distracted for a day, it would go out, leaving the family in the cold, so feeding it was the #1 priority, dictating the entire daily routine and all plans, making the family slaves to the fire, existing to maintain it for their own survival. Warmth is life in the truest sense. But what exactly do you do when the fragile walls of your wooden fortress are full of numerous gaps and cracks through which death inevitably seeps in the form of an icy wind. In the next practical chapter, you will learn in detail what ingenious tricks and improvisations desperate settlers resorted to in order to hermetically seal their primitive homes from the icy breath of winter that steals warmth. What I am about to show you is prohibited in 12 countries of common sense. We are used to living in houses with airtight walls, but for settlers, every gap between the logs was an open wound through which precious heat escaped. The war against drafts was no less important than gathering firewood, and the most unusual materials were used in this war. The process of sealing the joints was called chinking. Immediately after the hut was built, the gaps between the logs were huge. They were first caulked by stuffing any available fibrous material that could hold the main sealant inside. Everything was used: dried moss, grass, old rags. These materials created an elastic base. It was painstaking work that required patience and accuracy because the effectiveness of the entire heating system depended on it. Then the main sealing compound was applied on top of this base. The most common mixture was clay, sand, and water. Sometimes lime was added for strength or crushed grass for reinforcement. This compound was far from perfect. The clay cracked as it dried and flaked off due to temperature changes. Therefore, the sealing process was not a one-time thing. It had to be repeated every fall, and sometimes even in the middle of winter. Windows and doors were the main sources of drafts. Their frames rarely fit tightly. For the winter, the gaps around them were plugged with rags, paper, or any other sealant that could be found. Sometimes a homemade roller made of fabric stuffed with sand or sawdust was placed along the bottom of the door. This simple sausage dog, as it was sometimes called, effectively blocked the icy air flowing across the floor. It was a must-have for any hut, but even these measures were not enough. Wood is a living material. It constantly dried out and warped, creating new gaps and cracks. Settlers constantly inspected the walls, looking for places where cold air could be felt moving. In severe frosts, the walls could become covered with frost on the inside. This was a sure sign of poor sealing. Such places were immediately caulked using whatever was at hand. The fight against drafts was endless and required constant attention. It turned the house into a living organism that needed to be constantly treated. This invisible war was the key to survival in conditions where every degree of heat was worth its weight in gold. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the simplest architectural element of a house at first glance? The window? For us modern people, a window is a natural source of daylight and a comfortable view of the outside world for our psychological well-being. For the American pioneer settler, however, it was a painful dilemma of compromise. Let the light in and irretrievably lose precious heat to the outside, or keep the heat sealed in, but live in oppressive darkness for months on end. Windows were both the greatest inaccessible luxury and the greatest critical vulnerability of a primitive frontier cabin in terms of thermal insulation. Each window was a hole in the thermal envelope through which heat escaped faster than through 10 square meters of wooden wall of the same area, making windows the enemies of heating, but the friends of lighting and mental health, creating an irresolvable conflict of interest where any choice was a sacrifice of one for the other, without the possibility of obtaining both benefits at the same time. Real high-quality window glass was an incredibly expensive, imported and fragile commodity on the wild frontier. Delivering it to a remote frontier hundreds of kilometers away on terrible roads, without breaking at least half of it along the way, was a logistical feat and a stroke of luck. Therefore, the vast majority of poor settlers could not afford it financially in the early days of their existence. Glass cost as much as a month's supply of food. A glass window was a symbol of wealth and success, unattainable for most pioneers living on the brink of survival without extra money for luxuries, which included glass, despite its practical importance for lighting and morale, forcing them to do without it for years until their farms got on their feet and they had enough money to buy glass, which could break at any moment and need to be replaced. Instead of expensive glass, practical settlers used improvised oiled paper or thinly tanned translucent animal skins stretched over a frame. Such primitive windows let in a little murky, diffused daylight, creating semi-darkness, but did not protect at all from the penetrating cold and wind. There was zero insulation. They were more of a symbolic, decorative representation of a window for appearance than a functional thermal equivalent. The illusion of a window without its advantages. Such a window was worse than a blank wall. It provided little light but lost a lot of heat, the worst of both worlds. But it was better than complete darkness inside without windows at all, which was psychologically unbearable for people who needed visual contact with the outside world to maintain their sanity in the isolation of winter. Even if a lucky settler somehow managed to get real glass, the window openings were deliberately made as small as possible, 30 x 40 centimeter, to save money. A large panoramic window would have been an unthinkable waste of resources, a huge hole in the critical thermal envelope of the house, through which all the heat would have escaped instantly. Often, a modest 4x5-meter hut had only 1 or 2 tiny windows on opposite walls, the minimum for air circulation in the summer. They provided little light even during the day, and most of the room remained in shadow, requiring the eyes to adjust to the dim light in order to distinguish objects, which strained the eyes and limited the ability to perform work requiring precision. However, this was a compromise accepted by all in order to conserve heat, which was critical for survival in winter. At night after sunset and during severe daytime frost below -20 degrees, the windows were always tightly closed with massive internal or external wooden shutters. These shutters, made of thick oak or pine boards, were as vital a part of the defense against the cold as the walls of the hut themselves. They significantly reduced the loss of precious heat through the thin glass, creating an air layer of insulation. Closed shutters turned the window into a wall in terms of thermal insulation, but also in terms of light, plunging the room into darkness. So they were only open during the day in relatively warm weather, balancing light and heat depending on the temperature and time of day, which required constant manipulation, opening and closing, tiring but necessary to optimize conditions inside during the day. Due to the critical lack of natural light, life inside the dark hut practically came to a standstill and ceased with the onset of early winter twilight at 4 or 5 p.m. Artificial lighting, candles, lamps, was extremely dim and expensive in terms of resources. Tallow candles and primitive oil lamps burned valuable limited resources, lard, fat, oil, and gave off very little dim light with an unpleasant smell of burnt fat. One candle illuminated a radius of 1 meter with a dim light, insufficient for reading or precise work, and there might only be a few of them for the entire winter, which forced people to save every minute of burning time, lighting them only when absolutely necessary and extinguishing them immediately after completing the work that required light, which made evenings a time of forced idleness in the dark. Most often, the only available source of light in the evening was the dancing fire in the open hearth. Its flickering red-orange reflections on the walls created a mysterious, gloomy, and disturbing atmosphere of twilight with moving shadows. All the necessary evening work, repairing broken tools, spinning wool, mending clothes, was done by family members in this oppressive twilight by the fire, straining their eyes. Working in such lighting was tiring for the eyes and inaccurate. Difficult work was postponed until the morning, when there would be daylight from the window, which limited the productivity of the evening hours and forced people to go to bed early due to the lack of lighting for activity, turning evenings into wasted time waiting for dawn. Which aspect of winter life in an isolated cabin do you personally find most psychologically difficult and unbearable? The constant piercing cold, the endless hard physical labor, or the oppressive lack of light? A successful winter did not begin with the first snow, but long before it in the summer and autumn. Creating a winter food supply was a crucial task on which the life of the family directly depended. The settler's pantry was not just a collection of food, but a carefully planned arsenal of calories. The basis of the diet consisted of foods that could be stored for a long time without refrigeration. Dried and smoked foods occupied the main place. Wild animal meat was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or smoked, turning it into a kind of jerky. Grains such as corn and wheat were the basis of survival. They were stored in sacks in a dry place, protected from rodents. Corn was used to make coarse flour, which was used to bake flatbread and cook porridge. Simple but filling food. Vegetables grown in their own gardens also needed to be preserved. Pumpkins and squash could be stored in a cool place for several months. Beans and peas were dried and stored in sacks, using them to make soups and stews. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, were stored in a cellar or underfloor storage. This was a specially dug room under the hut, where the temperature remained just above freezing. This environment allowed the vegetables to stay fresh until spring. Salt was a strategic resource. It was used not only as a seasoning, but also as the main preservative. Meat and fish were salted in large barrels, which allowed them to be preserved for many months. Sugar was a rarity and a luxury. Maple syrup or wild honey, if it could be collected, was more commonly used as a sweetener. These products were also a source of quick calories, necessary for hard physical work. In addition to their own provisions, the settlers relied on hunting, but winter hunting was difficult and unreliable. Catching an animal in deep snow was a stroke of luck. Therefore, the main emphasis was always on pre-made supplies. The diet was monotonous and consisted mainly of the same foods. But this was not food chosen for its taste. It was fuel needed to keep the fire of life burning in conditions of constant cold and hard labor. Planning supplies was a real art. It was necessary to calculate exactly how much food a family would need for 6 to 7 months of isolation. A mistake in the calculations could lead to starvation at the end of winter, when help could no longer come. What if I told you the shocking truth that the simplest and most familiar thing to us modern people, water, required settlers to engage in a daily heroic struggle and risk their lives? We thoughtlessly turn on the tap in the bathroom and instantly get clean water of any temperature in unlimited quantities without thinking about the miracle. For settlers on the wild frontier, obtaining drinking water in the winter cold was a difficult, exhausting, and life-threatening task that had to be performed every single day in any weather. Blizzards, frost, snowstorms, without days off or rest. Without water, a person dies of dehydration in 3 days faster than from hunger. So obtaining water was a priority for survival that could not be delayed or neglected, forcing people to go outside in any cold and wind, risking frostbite and injury for a bucket of water, which today we get by turning on the tap in a second without effort or thought about its value. If there was a non-freezing stream or river within walking distance of the hut, it was rightly considered good luck and a blessing when choosing a place to build. However, with the onset of severe November frosts, any body of water would inevitably be covered with a thick, solid layer of ice, completely blocking access to water. Every day at dawn, someone from the family had to take a heavy axe or a special ice pick and go to the river to cut a new hole or clear the old one, which had become covered with ice overnight. The hole was covered with boards and branches to slow down the freezing process. But overnight, it was still covered with a crust of ice that had to be broken through again every morning. An endless cycle of Sisyphean labor, where what had been achieved yesterday was destroyed overnight by nature, and it was necessary to start all over again every day without any progress. This monotonous work of cutting through the ice was both physically exhausting and dangerous. The thickness of the solid ice could easily reach tens of centimeters, 20-30 centimeters by midwinter, turning into stone. It took a lot of precious time, half an hour to an hour. An effort, swinging a heavy axe to break through to the running water under the ice, kneeling in the piercing icy wind by the river, exposed on all sides without protection. My hands froze, went numb, and lost sensitivity and grip strength in minutes. Drops of water from the hole splashed onto his clothes and face, instantly freezing into an icy crust. But the job had to be finished. Otherwise, the family would be left without water for the day. Retreat was impossible. Only victory over the ice at any cost, even at the cost of frostbite on his fingers or face, which was a frequent outcome of carelessness or haste. After the hole was finally ready and opened up access to the water itself still had to be carried hundreds of meters to the house. It was scooped up and carried in heavy wooden buckets, on a yoke or in hands that were heavy even when empty. The path from the frozen river to the hut along a narrow, slippery trail in the snow was a real dangerous test of balance and strength. The buckets of water weighed 15-20 kilograms each, and carrying them across the ice and snow over such a distance required enormous physical strength and endurance, which children and the elderly did not have, making water collection the responsibility of young and strong men and women who were able to withstand the load and not fall, breaking something and spilling precious water, which would have to be retrieved again. Water spilled from buckets while walking on uneven paths instantly froze in the cold, mercilessly turning wet clothes into a hard icy shell that restricted movement and made the path even more dangerous and slippery with ice. Every single trip to the river for water was a real risk to health and in life. It was easy to slip on the ice, fall with the buckets, and suffer a serious injury. A fracture, dislocation, or contusion, far from any qualified medical care, which was hundreds of kilometers away on the frontier. A broken leg or arm meant not just pain, but months of disability, an inability to work and obtain food, water, and firewood, which threatened the survival of the entire family, which depended on the labor of each member. There were no spare people, everyone counted, and the loss of one worker was a disaster for everyone. If there was no open, unfrozen water near the hut at all, no river, no stream, no well, the only available source of moisture for survival was the ubiquitous snow. But to get one full bucket of liquid water with a volume of 10 liters, it was necessary to melt a huge amount of loose snow, 10, 15 times more in volume, several buckets of snow for one bucket of water. This required a significant additional expenditure of scarce firewood and time for heating, which was wasteful in conditions of limited resources. Melting snow over a fire was a slow process. It took hours to obtain enough water for the family for a day, requiring constant supervision and adding firewood, distracting from other tasks. But there was no choice if there was no other source of water within reach. Snow was the last hope for water, although extremely inefficient in terms of resource consumption. The water brought into the house with such difficulty then had to be carefully protected from freezing again inside. Inside the hut, the temperature was extremely uneven throughout the space, from the heat of the hearth to the cold in the corners. Far from the hearth, especially on a cold night when the fire died down, the water in wooden buckets could treacherously turn back into useless ice, making the morning's work of fetching it futile. Frozen water in a bucket was a disaster. It could not be used until it was melted, which required time and firewood, or it was necessary to go for new water, repeating the whole cycle again. Losing a day, double work for one water was a punishment for careless storage. Therefore, the strategic water supply in buckets was always kept as close as possible to the fire in the hearth, where the temperature was constantly above zero. This created additional critical crampedness and clutter in the already extremely limited space of the tiny 4x5-meter hut. But there was no other practical way to keep the water liquid. Either live in cramped quarters with buckets by the fire, or have frozen, useless water in the corner. The choice was obvious, and the family put up with the inconvenience of tripping over buckets in order to have access to water at any time, without having to go out into the cold or spend time melting ice. The warmth of water was more important than the comfort of space, and survival priorities dictated the organization of daily life over convenience. Water was urgently needed not only for drinking and cooking hot food, basic needs. It was absolutely necessary for minimal personal hygiene, washing your face, hands, and clothes. The ability to heat a whole bucket of water on the fire and wash thoroughly with warm water was a real luxury, which required a lot of valuable fuel and heating time. Therefore, people washed rarely, once a week or less, saving water and firewood, which led to the accumulation of dirt, the proliferation of parasites, and the spread of disease in crowded and unsanitary conditions. But there was no alternative. Cleanliness required resources that were not enough for survival, so hygiene was sacrificed for more important needs: drinking, eating, warmth, leaving people dirty but alive, which was a lesser evil than clean but frozen or hungry. Thus, the simple basic human need for water, 2 to 3 liters per person per day, turned into a daily exhausting cycle of hard, dangerous work from dawn This is another striking example of how things that are absolutely ordinary and self-evident to us modern people were a matter of life and death, literally survival for the settlers of the 19th century frontier. Do you think we would appreciate water more and understand its true value if we had to fight so desperately for every liter every day, risking our lives instead of getting it for free by turning on the tap without thinking about the miracle of the water supply system? Food, water, and warmth are the three sacred pillars of human physical survival in nature. But how can we practically organize our lives and daily routines so that we can provide all of these vital necessities at the same time without fail? In the next chapter, you will learn about the iron discipline and strict routine that reigned in every frontier cabin as the only way to survive. In the next chapter, you will learn about the iron discipline and strict routine that reigned in every frontier cabin as the only way to survive. Winter life in the cabin was governed not by desire, but by necessity. Survival was only possible with the strictest routine, repeated day after day. This monotonous routine was the only way to cope with the enormous amount of work and not succumb to despair. The day began long before dawn, in complete darkness and cold. The first task was to stoke the dying embers in the hearth and rekindle the fire. This determined whether the family would be able to warm up and prepare breakfast. While the fire was burning, it was necessary to bring in a new supply of firewood and water. These tasks were performed in the icy twilight. Only then could a meager breakfast be prepared, usually consisting of corn porridge or flatbread. After breakfast, the main work of the day began. The men chopped wood, repaired tools and harnesses, or made simple furniture. Every minute of daylight was used for tasks that required good lighting. The women were also busy from morning till night. They prepared food, spun wool, wove, sewed, and mended clothes. Worn-out clothes were not thrown away. They were patched up as long as possible. Even the simplest household tasks became a laborious process. Washing was a real challenge, requiring a large amount of water to be heated and clothes to be dried for a long time by the fire. Therefore, washing was done infrequently and only when absolutely necessary. When dusk fell, active work ceased. The family gathered around the hearth for dinner. This was the only time when everyone could relax a little and be together. Evenings were spent in quiet activities that did not require bright light. Men could carve something out of wood. Women could darn clothes. Sometimes someone would read aloud if there was a literate person in the family and a book, most often the Bible. Sleep was the only way to conserve resources, firewood and food. They went to bed very early, shortly after sunset. The long winter night was a time of rest and recuperation for the next equally difficult day. This strict and monotonous routine was a psychological support. It structured time, leaving no room for idle and depressing thoughts. In conditions of complete isolation, routine was as much a tool for survival as an axe or a gun. The most insidious enemy in winter was not the cold or hunger. It was an invisible enemy lurking in the minds of the settlers themselves. Cabin fever. This was the name given to the psychological condition caused by prolonged isolation in a confined space. Imagine a family locked up for several months in a single room. Constant semi-darkness, cold, monotonous food, and no personal space. In such conditions, even the strongest relationships could crack. The days merged into an endless series of identical events. The monotony of everyday life weighed heavily on the psyche. The lack of new experiences and communication with other people led to apathy and irritability. Minor everyday disagreements, which no one would have paid attention to in normal life, escalated into serious conflicts in conditions of isolation. Constantly being in each other's sight left no opportunity to be alone and calm down. People became silent and withdrawn, or conversely, overly excitable. The longing for sunlight, green grass, and open space became almost physical. The surrounding world shrunk to the size of four walls. To combat this state, the settlers intuitively sought any way to diversify their lives. Any insignificant event, an animal track outside the window, or an unusual cloud formation, became the subject of lengthy discussions. It was a way to connect with the outside world. Simple entertainment played an important role. Wood carving, making toys, playing musical instruments if they had any. All of this helped to distract them. Telling stories and family legends was not just entertainment, but a way to preserve the connection between generations. Reading, for those who knew how, was a real salvation. Books allowed people to mentally leave the walls of their huts and immerse themselves in another world. They were a window into another reality, providing food for the mind and imagination. Despite all these tricks, cabin fever remained a serious threat. It tested not only the physical strength, but also the mental strength of the settlers. The ability to maintain sanity and peace in the family was one of the main conditions for survival. In winter isolation, the family's life depended entirely on a small set of simple tools. These were not just pieces of metal and wood. Each tool was an extension of the settler's hand, his main ally in the struggle for existence, and its breakage could be a disaster. The main tool was, without a doubt, the axe. It was used to fell trees, chop wood, and trim logs for repairs. A good sharp axe was worth its weight in gold, and its condition was monitored with particular care. The handsaw was the second most important tool for working with wood. It allowed thick logs to be sawn into blocks and boards. Working with a two-handed saw was hard work, but without it, it would have been impossible to prepare enough firewood. An auger and a drill were necessary for drilling holes in wood. They were used to make mortise and tenon joints when making furniture or repairing structures. These simple tools allowed for the creation of strong and reliable joints without a single nail. Knives of various sizes were used for hundreds of tasks. They were used for planing, cutting, and carving small details. A good knife was a versatile tool that was always at hand. Awls and needles were tools of the female world, but their importance was no less. They were used to repair clothes and shoes, without which it was impossible to go outside. The ability to sew was as vital a skill as the ability to wield an axe. Hammers and blades were used for chopping wood and other tasks. Settlers often had a small makeshift forge where they could forge a simple nail or repair a broken metal part. This skill made them completely self-sufficient. All tools required constant maintenance. Blades had to be sharpened regularly on a whetstone. Wooden handles had to be checked for cracks and replaced if necessary. The loss or breakage of a key tool, such as an axe in the middle of winter, was an emergency. It could jeopardize the entire life support system. Therefore, tools were stored carefully and used wisely. This modest set was the settlers' entire technological arsenal. It proves that it is not sophisticated machines that are important for survival, but basic skills and reliable, simple tools. In skilled hands, they could work wonders. After long months of darkness and cold, a turning point came. The arrival of spring was not a sudden event, but a slow, barely noticeable process that the settlers felt with every fiber of their being. It was not just a warming, but a real rebirth. The first sign was not streams, but a change in the quality of light. The sun began to shine brighter, the days grew longer. Its rays, penetrating through the small window, carried not only light, but also the first, still faint promise of warmth. Then came the sounds. The roof began to drip, slowly at first, 1 drop per hour, and then faster and faster. The sound of dripping was the most beautiful music to ears, tired of the silence of winter. The snow around the hut began to settle and darken. The first patches of bare ground appeared, revealing gray, lifeless earth. But even this sight was joyful because it meant the end of the snow's captivity. With the arrival of warmth, the daily routine changed. Now it was possible to spend more time outside, repairing the hut and preparing for spring work. Just being able to leave the house and breathe in the fresh, moist air was a huge relief. However, early spring also brought new dangers. The melting snow could lead to flooding. The soggy ground turned into impassable mud, making it still difficult to move around. Food supplies were running low by this time. It was the hungriest period, when the old had already been eaten and the new had not yet grown. Families finished off the last of their supplies, eagerly awaiting the first signs of greenery. Despite the difficulties, the psychological state of the people changed dramatically. Apathy and fatigue were replaced by hope and a surge of energy. The end of winter was a major victory, proof that they had been able to survive. They had survived the siege. They emerged from their fortress unbroken. This victory over the cold and darkness gave them strength for a new cycle of life on this harsh but beautiful land. Their successful wintering was not a miracle, but the result of hard work, foresight, and incredible resilience. It was the highest manifestation of the human spirit, capable of adapting and surviving in the most extreme conditions. We went through a long and harsh winter in a log cabin, seeing not a romantic picture, but a daily struggle for survival. The battle for warmth, the war against drafts, the search for water, and monotonous labor. All this was a reality for hundreds of thousands of settlers who were developing the frontier. Their experience is not just historical facts, but a hymn to human perseverance. Armed only with an axe, ingenuity, and an unyielding will, these people proved that it is possible to survive in any conditions. Their legacy is a lesson in the importance of appreciating the simple things we take for granted today: heat, light, water, and food. This is a story about how true human strength is revealed not in comfort, but in overcoming difficulties. What other aspects of life on the American frontier would you like to explore? Perhaps you are interested in the construction of forts, the life of trappers, or the peculiarities of farming on the prairies? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.